Tonight's presentation, Tale of Two Prebuys. Our presenter is Mike Bush. Mike is president for Savvy Aviation Incorporated. He's author for numerous aviation publications, does webinars for EAA for the past decade now, and a real advocate for educating aircraft owners on maintenance issues for their aircraft. Mike has a certified flight instructor certificate, A&P mechanic certificate with the IA privileges, 2008 FAA's Aviation Maintenance Technician of the Year, and a member of EAA. Mike, I'm turning control of presentation over to you.
Okay, let's see if I can grab it. Hi, Tim. Hello, everybody. Looks like I succeeded in grabbing it. I would like to apologize for this webinar being on a Tuesday instead of on a Wednesday. It was originally scheduled for last Wednesday, but it turned out that last Wednesday I was on an airliner flying from Dublin, Ireland to Los Angeles, and it was going to be really hard to do the webinar aloft. I did have internet on the airplane, but it wasn't very good. At any rate, so we had to reschedule it for today, and I hope that didn't inconvenience anybody. We're going to be talking about pre-buys tonight. My company manages a lot of pre-buys. At any given point in time, we typically are managing a dozen pre-buys or so. And over the years, we've managed thousands of these things, and we've had a lot of them go smoothly, and we've had a few of them go terribly, and pretty much seen everything that can go wrong with a pre-buy, which is good because we, learn, like everybody, learn mostly from our mistakes. And then, most of the aircraft that we do pre-buys on turn out to be in decent shape, and the outcome is a successful purchase by the buyer. Frequently, we almost never have a completely clean pre-buy, and it's very common that the pre-buy will uncover some discrepancies. It's almost inevitable that it will. Some of the discrepancies are cosmetic, some of them are airworthiness issues. Our general rule of thumb is that the seller really should pay to have the airworthiness issues corrected, but that the cosmetic issues are really the responsibility of the buyer. Because if you're buying a used airplane, our philosophy is you're not entitled to get a perfect airplane. If you want a perfect airplane, buy a new one under warranty. But you should be entitled to get an airworthy airplane. So that's generally the rule of thumb that we use. Occasionally, however, a pre-buy will uncover problems so serious to persuade the buyer to walk away from the deal and go find another purchase candidate. That doesn't happen a lot, but when it does happen, we feel good that we've that we've protected our client, who's the buyer, from buying a lemon, and that's one of the most valuable things we can do. So let me start with, before I tell you the two tales of pre-buys that I want to talk to you about tonight. Let me talk briefly about what we consider to be the golden rule of pre-buys. And when this rule is followed, the outcome is usually good, and when this rule is not followed, often the outcome is terrible. And the golden rule is simply this: pre-buy should always be done by a shop or mechanic who is, first of all, highly experienced with the particular make and model involved, so he knows where to look. But secondly, and at least as important, is truly independent and impartial. And when I say independent, what I mean is that the shop or mechanic that's selected to do the pre-buy needs to have no prior exposure to the aircraft being examined and no prior relationship with the seller, or if there's a broker involved, with the seller's broker. You know, if a pre-buy is done by a mechanic who's been working on the airplane, which I see happen a lot, you can't expect that mechanic to give an honest appraisal of the condition of the airplane. If you know, if he said, hey, this airplane's got serious problems, he's basically indicting his own work because he's probably signed off the last couple of annuals. So you can't have a pre-buy done by somebody who has been working on the airplane. You got to find somebody who's never seen the airplane before and can come to it with an appropriate degree of skepticism. And also, of course, the pre-buy guy should not have any relationship with the seller, because the pre-buy is being done for the sole benefit of the buyer. So it would be a conflict of interest. So, you know, following this rule that the mechanic who does the pre-buy has no prior relationship with the airplane, no prior relationship with the seller or the seller's broker, is the only way that we can have confidence that the pre-buy findings will be thorough, honest, and unbiased. So with that as preface, let me tell you the story of two pre-buys. One was done by an independent mechanic, and one was done by one that wasn't quite so independent, and the outcomes were very different. And this will illustrate the point that I was trying to make about the golden rule. Now, I've changed names to protect the guilty parties, but everything else I'm going to tell you is exactly how things happen. So the first pre-buy I want to talk about involves a Cessna 340. And the buyer's name, we'll call him Bert. It's not his real name, but Bert the buyer, easy to remember. And he was looking for a cabin class pressurized twin, and he diligently searched all the usual online resources, Aircraft Shopper Online and Trade a Plane and Controller. And eventually he located what looked like a promising purchase candidate. And it was a Cessna 340, located in the deep south. It was listed by an airplane broker by the name of Brad on behalf of the seller, who we'll call Sam. Again, Brad and Sam are names I made up. Sam the seller, Bert the buyer, Brad the broker. Those are our cast of characters here. So Bert made an offer. Brad conveyed the offer to Sam, and Sam accepted the offer. And so they had a deal contingent on a successful outcome of a pre-buy examination. Because Bert was located in the Pacific Northwest and Sam was located in the deep South, that's where the airplane was located. Bert asked my company, Savvy Aviation, to manage the pre-buy for him. Frequently, that's how we get involved, is the buyer and the airplane are at a significant distance from one another, and so it's difficult for the buyer to manage the pre-buy himself. Now, we're always kind of nervous about managing pre-buys on airplanes as sophisticated and complex as a Cessna 340 because we've seen so many times that these complicated airplanes can really turn into a money pit unless they were extremely well maintained and cared for over their life. And in this case, we're talking about a Cessna 340, and there are only a small handful of twin Cessna specialty shops in the country that we would really feel comfortable evaluating an airplane of this complexity. There's one in Southern California, there's one in Wichita, Kansas, there's one in Ohio, and there are a couple in Texas. And that pretty much is the landscape of twin Cessna specialists. And since I own a twin Cessna, I kind of keep track of these things pretty closely. So the closest of these Twin Cessna specialty shops to where the aircraft was located were the ones in Texas. And so we advised Bert, our client, the buyer, that we recommended having the pre-buy examination done at a shop in the Dallas area that we'd worked with many times before and known that they were extremely knowledgeable about twin Cessnas and extremely thorough. In fact, they were so thorough that we tended to be a little bit nervous about having our clients do annual inspections there because they would always find all sorts of problems with the airplanes, and the annual inspections or the annual ordeals, let's say, would turn out to be very expensive. But for a pre-buy, a super picky shop is exactly the kind that you want. You want them to find everything that's wrong with the airplane. And you want them to be super thorough. So we felt that this would be the perfect place to bring this Cessna 340 for a pre-buy. We contacted the shop in Dallas, and like most really good shops these days, they said that their shop schedule was booked solid and that it would be some weeks before they could find a spot that they could shoehorn in a pre-buy on Sam's airplane. Sam was not happy about this, Sam being the seller. First of all, he wasn't real happy about flying his airplane to Dallas. And he wasn't really very happy about waiting several weeks to have the pre-buy done. He wanted to sell the airplane quicker than that. And Sam's broker started to get concerned that the deal was going to fall through, and his commission was at risk, as brokers tend to do. So the broker, Brad, suggested that instead of taking the plane to this Twin Cessna specialty shop in Dallas, that wouldn't be able to look at the airplane for several weeks, that the pre-buy be done by an ANPIA that he knew named Ed, who ran a little shop, some LLC, located close by where the airplane was based, and that Brad contended was quite knowledgeable about twin Cessnas. So Brad was suggesting that Ed do the pre-buy instead of this shop in Dallas that we recommended. Now when Brad made this recommendation, we were kind of like, who is this Ed guy? We've never heard of this Ed. This is not somebody who is on our radar screen or had any sort of a reputation that we knew about. But what we did know about him is that Brad recommended him. And that set off alarm bells because it would be a clear violation of our independent pre-buy golden rule that said that the guy who does the pre-buy should have no prior relationship with either the seller or the seller's broker. And clearly Ed had some kind of prior relationship with Brad. So we weren't really terribly comfortable about having Brad do the pre-buy. Because if he did, we could never really be sure who his allegiance would be to. Would his allegiance be to the buyer, our client, or would his allegiance be to Brad or to Sam? And this is the sort of situation we always try to avoid in pre-buys. In the meantime, Brad, the broker, was telling our client, Bert, that he better get this deal done quickly because Brad had a bunch of other interested buyers lined up who were interested in Sam's airplane. Now, this is something that brokers always do. I've never been involved in a deal with a broker where the broker didn't put time pressure on the buyer and make representations that he better close the deal within the next week or he's going to lose the airplane to somebody else. And usually they make this stuff up, but this is just kind of typical broker behavior in my experience. They always try to put time pressure to get the deal done quickly. And unfortunately, Bert succumbed to the pressure and didn't want to lose the airplane. This is another problem that we have a lot, that typically when a buyer comes to us and asks us to manage a pre-buy for him, the buyer's already bought the airplane in his mind. And you know, the pre-buy is just kind of a formality. And the buyers frequently do not approach the airplane that they're looking to buy with an appropriate degree of skepticism either. So one of our jobs is to try to inject an appropriate dose of skepticism into the equation. But at any rate, because of the pressure and Bert's fear that he might lose this airplane, and contrary to our advice, Bert agreed to have this Ed guy perform the pre-buy of Sam's airplane, the Ed guy that broker Brad recommended. So we reluctantly put together a pre-buy checklist and sent it to Ed with specific items that we wanted him to focus on during the pre-buy. Things like the landing gear, which is often a problem area on these twin Cessnas. We're looking for corrosion in the exhaust trails, and just things that we knew from experience were frequent problems with twin Cessnas. And we put together a pre-buy checklist and sent it over to Ed. Crossed our fingers, feeling that this pre-buy was not getting off to a really good start. But the client, I guess, has the right to have the pre-buy done by whoever he wants to. So no sooner had this airplane been delivered to Ed's shop for this pre-buy, Brad, the broker, threw another curveball into the equation, realizing that the Cessna 340's annual inspection was about to expire. Brad proposed that instead of doing a normal pre-buy, that Ed actually do an annual inspection on the airplane in lieu of a pre-buy, so that the annual wouldn't expire and that the airplane would hopefully be delivered to the buyer, Brad, with a fresh annual inspection. Now, I've written and done webinars in the past about why you should never do this, why pre-buy an annual inspection should never be done in lieu of a pre-buy, because the goals of a pre-buy and the goals of an annual inspection are very, very, very different. It's not unusual for a pre-buy to be converted into an annual inspection once the buyer decides to buy the airplane. But while we're in the pre-buy phase and prior to the decision to buy, the inspection should never be structured as an annual inspection. But that's what Brad proposed, and the annual was about to expire, and Sam, the seller, agreed to pay for the annual, which he would, I guess, have to do, and to pay for the repair of any airworthiness discrepancies found during the annual. Now, Bert thought this was a wonderful idea because now he wouldn't have to pay for a pre-buy, and he immediately agreed to this proposal. We thought it was a terrible idea. Why do we think it was a terrible idea? Well, think about it. Under what the broker was proposing, Sam, the seller, would be paying Ed's bill. So Ed would be working for Sam. Sam would be calling the shots. And Ed, the mechanic, would have absolutely no duty of care to our client, Bert. That's not the way the pre-buys are supposed to be. Pre-buys are supposed to be where the mechanic is hired by the buyer to evaluate the airplane independently. And the mechanic's sole duty of care is to the buyer who hired him. But this turns the whole thing on its head, where the seller is hiring the mechanic that the seller's broker recommended and paying his bill, and now the allegiance of the mechanic is totally to the seller and not to the buyer. So, from where we sat, this now had morphed. It was no longer a pre-buy whose purpose it was, to protect Bert from buying a lemon. It had morphed into some scheme cooked up by Sam and his broker to get the airplane sold with no questions asked. Unfortunately, Bert was fully on board with this, thought it was a great idea, and we could not convince him otherwise. So Ed performed the annual inspection, found a few airworthiness issues, performed a few $1,000s worth of repairs on the airplane, signed off the annual as airworthy, and based on Ed's annual inspection sign off, Bert decided to buy the airplane, had it ferried home to the Pacific Northwest, and started flying his new acquisition around. Fast forward a year, and the airplane was due for its next annual inspection, the first annual inspection on the new owner's watch. Now, the first annual inspection on a new owner's watch is always, in my experience, a come to Jesus moment, because they always find a bunch of stuff wrong right after an airplane changes hands. And as it happened, Bert took his airplane to a very good shop in Northern California, a shop that we've used many times and we recommend highly, very experienced with twin Cessnas, and had them perform the annual inspection on the airplane. And as you might guess, the inspection findings were nothing short of catastrophic. The first thing that the shop discovered very quickly, just in the logbook review, was that all 12 cylinders on the two Continental engines were illegal. They were ECI cylinders that had been essentially mandated to be removed by an AD 2016-1612, and should never have been on those engines. And how Ed signed off the annual as airworthy with 12 cylinders that were AD'd into lamp bases is, I'll let you draw your own conclusions about that. But at any rate, they had to pull off all 12 cylinders. And of course, you can probably figure out what came next when they pulled the cylinders off and looked at the cams. The cams were in bad shape. And Bert was now facing two engine teardowns that he had not anticipated or budgeted for. Now, in fairness, there probably isn't any way that the pre-buy would have discovered the cam problem, but it certainly should have discovered the cylinder problem. That's something that should have been discovered during logbook research during the annual. And whenever we do a pre-buy, the very first thing on the pre-buy checklist is a complete logbook review looking for AD compliance. It also turned out that there were some serious problems with the landing gear that would be extremely costly to correct. And as I mentioned, this is something we always ask to be focused on during pre-buys on twin Cessnas, because it's just a known problem with these airplanes that they develop landing gear problems. But obviously, Ed didn't take a very close look at the landing gear either when he did his so-called annual inspection. So by the time the dust settled, the shop in Northern California, very good shop, presented Bert with a repair estimate of well over $300,000. The repair estimate was actually more than what he paid for the airplane. And clearly this so-called annual inspection was, I guess, you can't draw any conclusion that it was grotesquely pencil whipped for the benefit of Sam and Bert. Sam and Brad, and certainly to the huge detriment of Bert. So this was a very bad outcome, a very bad outcome indeed, and it was a result of some very poor decision making on the part of the buyer that we tried to convince him not to make, but were unsuccessful. There's no doubt in my mind that had this pre-buy done by the shop in Dallas that we recommended in the first place, the super picky shop that I was telling you about, that the illegal cylinder problems would have quickly been identified. The landing gear problems would have been uncovered, and Bert would have never purchased this airplane. But sadly, Bert decided to follow the advice of the seller's broker rather than the advice we gave him. I'm not sure why he hired us to manage the pre-buy and then disregard our advice, but clearly he had bought the airplane in his mind, didn't want to lose it, and succumbed to the broker's pressure. And the pre-buy, or the so-called pre-buy, which wasn't really a pre-buy, was about as far from being independent and impartial as you possibly could get. And I was very upset about this, but there wasn't really anything we could do to prevent it. The buyer made these decisions, and we couldn't talk him out of them. So, at any rate, that was the ugly one. We'll contrast this with another pre-buy. This one involved a buyer that I will call Smitty, again, not his real name, who had found an old Bonanza, 1958 J35 Bonanza, located in a T hangar in Arkansas for sale by owner. There was no broker involved in this transaction. It was a direct transaction between Smitty and the seller. So Smitty made an offer, the seller agreed to it, and we were once again asked to manage a pre-buy on it. Again, we were kind of nervous about this one, not because the Bonanza is a particularly complex airplane, but because it was a very old airplane. And in our experience, the older the airplane is, the more likely it is to have skeletons in its closet with regard to its condition and maintenance and so on. So, we get kind of nervous doing pre-buys on really old airplanes that we're going to find something bad. Now, in most cases, what we try to, when we're asked to manage a pre-buy, we search for a shop or a mechanic within a reasonable striking distance of where the airplane is based, but far enough away that it didn't have any prior relationship with the airplane or the seller. And our general rule of thumb is that we need to find a place to have the pre-buy done that's no more than an hour's flying time away from where the airplane's located, preferably less than an hour. But again, needs to be far enough away that the shop has never worked on the airplane, and there's no relationship between the shop or mechanic and the guy who's selling the airplane. In this case, we wound up doing something a little different than that, a little different than our standard procedure. We used a fellow by the name of Mike Teeger. This is actually his real name, so only real name I'm using in this webinar. Who has an outfit called Mobile Aircraft Maintenance. It's not called Mobile Aircraft Maintenance because it's located in Mobile. It's called Mobile Aircraft Maintenance because he's a traveling mechanic, he operated a GA maintenance shop in Florida for more than 2 decades. But these days, he mostly just travels around the country doing pre-buys. So instead of having to bring the airplane to him, he goes to the airplane. Now, this particular Bonanza was kept in a T hangar that was equipped with a well-stocked toolbox, a compressor, and a set of jacks. Obviously, the owner who was selling the airplane had worked on the airplane did preventive maintenance and so on. So we had a reasonable environment for Mike to come and do the pre-buy. I mean, he can bring some basic tools with him, but he's going there typically on the airline, so he can't bring a 600-pound toolbox along or jacks. But at any rate, this hangar was equipped with all the necessary stuff. So Mike hopped on an airline and found his way to this T hangar, and Smitty decided to tag along so that he could look over Mike's shoulder and watch while Mike did the pre-buy, which is not always feasible, but it's a great thing to do if you can as a buyer. So of course the first thing Mike did was pull the airplane out of the hangar, run up the engine, get it warm, and then do a compression test. All the cylinders measured 70 over 80 or better. And then he pulled out his bore scope and started bore scoping the cylinders. Mike Teeger, he's my kind of guy. He's a bore scope nut. He puts bore scopes places that you didn't even think that they could go. And he just captures like tons of pictures of everything. So it's very helpful when a mechanic will do that. So he bore scoped all the cylinders, and all the cylinders and pistons and valves looked fine under the bore scope. Then because this was a sandcast style Continental, he was able to insert the scope through the oil filler port and get a good look at several cam lobes and several lifters, and those all look good too. He snapped pictures of all of those, and so that we could look at them as well. He captured images of inside the wings and empennage, and the whole structure of the airplane seemed remarkably corrosion free for an airplane that was 66 years old and based in Arkansas. So this pre-buy seemed to be getting off on the right foot. And independent mechanic, and initially everything was looking pretty good. But as Mike worked his way deeper into the airplane and went through the pre-buy checklist, he started finding things that troubled him. He took copious notes of his findings and took tons and tons of high-resolution photographs, including lots of bore scope images. He put them all in a Dropbox folder so that we could look at them remotely. And but by the time he was done with this pre-buy, he had assembled a list of 44 airworthiness discrepancies. I won't go through all 44 with you, but I'll give you just a sample of some of the things he found going through this bonanza. So the window sealant is failing in several locations, and the windows are starting to craze. The registration for the aircraft was still in the previous owner's names. The cowl flap cable extremely hard to operate. The cowl flaps. I'm sorry, that's a duplicate. That's the same one we just did. The engine cowling was in very poor condition. It had holes, cracks in it, improper repairs with less than minimum allowable rivet spacing. Ignition leads were improperly routed and rubbing hard on the fuel injection lines. Many inspection panels had missing or damaged nut plates, incorrect screws installed. Both brake calipers were leaking badly. The brake linings were worn out. The brake discs were scored. The alternator B+ cable, the heavy duty cable on the output of the alternator, was chafed through. Installation due to poor routing. He considered this a fire hazard. The alternator field leads appear to be automotive wire and automotive crimp terminals with very poor workmanship. All three landing gear struts exhibited excessive hydraulic fluid leakage, and would need to be disassembled and completely resealed. The left aileron cable was rubbing on the landing gear, fuel stains in the left wheel well, nose gear cable assembled incorrectly, or rubbing on the side of the pulley. The whole geometry of that control cable was incorrect. The pulley needs to be removed and inspected. Cotter pins of wrong size appear to be automotive cotter pins, very poor workmanship. Smoking loose rivets in several locations in the wings and fuselage. Engine cooling baffles fit poorly, cracked in several places, missing screws, rivets, very poor workmanship. Wiring behind the instrument panel is a mess, improperly secured, missing hardware, melted spiral wrap on some of the wiring, rubbing in many places, very poor workmanship. Alternate air door not sealing properly. The induction boot is disintegrating. Corrosion on and around the battery box. Rivets incorrectly installed in the lower engine compartment. I won't go through all of this stuff with you, but you can see that it just went on and on and on. And he summed up his findings. He said, the aircraft is not airworthy at the time of this inspection. Please review the Dropbox folder for current condition photos. The aircraft has been recently poorly maintained, and likely work was performed by a non-A&P. Remember, this was in the T hangar that was very well stocked with tools and jags. So you can imagine who the non-A&P probably was. But likely work was done by a non-A&P with very little or no supervision. I would not feel safe test flying this Bonanza. That's a pretty, that's a pretty clear verdict on the part of Mike, and I was just super impressed with the work he did on this pre-buy. It was extremely thorough, it was extremely well documented, both in words and in high resolution images. We obviously reviewed Mike's findings and told Smitty that it goes without saying that we do not recommend buying this airplane. And again, Smitty had gone to Arkansas with the intention of flying this thing home. He had bought it in his mind, and it really was a good thing that he was there to actually look over Mike's shoulder and see all this stuff. And his comments back to us at the conclusion of this was, the plane is certainly not what the seller represented. The Bonanza was still in corrosion-free condition after 66 years. It's really too bad that the maintenance work was so atrocious. With a little love along the way, it could have been a great airplane. What a shame. I guess I'll start looking for another purchase candidate. So, this is the sort of good illustration of why it is so important to do a real honest to God, independent, thorough pre-buy examination before buying an airplane. And it's sad when a pre-buy ends with a thumbs down verdict like Smitty's did, and he has to walk away from the airplane that he really was hoping to buy. But it's a lot sadder when the thumbs down verdict comes a year later at the first annual inspection on the new owner's watch, the way Bert's did. And the difference between these two outcomes was, that one had, Smitty had an independent, honest pre-buy, and Bert didn't. So that's the reason for the golden rule. And with that, that's all I have as far as prepared material, Tim. But we can open it up for some Q&A if there's time.
You bet, Mike. Let's jump in here. Steve was wondering, how can a buyer verify the mechanic has no exposure to the aircraft or prior relationship with the seller?
Well, I mean, a couple of things. First of all, you ask. Second of all, that's why we typically take the airplane some distance away from where it's based to get it out of the seller's sphere of influence. In this case, I think in the case of Smitty's, we didn't take the airplane away from the seller. We brought in a mechanic from far away. Either way works, but you know, you wouldn't want to have a pre-buy done on the airport where the airplane is based, because there's a very high likelihood that anybody who works on that airport has seen that airplane before, and there's a very high likelihood that anybody who works on the airport has had some interface with the seller before. You know, the most egregious case was was illustrated by the Bert's disaster. Was you never want to use a mechanic that the seller or the seller's broker recommends. I mean, just the fact that they recommend it says that there's a relationship there, and it's sort of the kiss of death as far as we're concerned. So I mean, it's also, of course, we take a look through the logbooks and to see who's worked on the airplane, and you know, anybody whose name is in the logbook is somebody who is essentially disqualified from doing the pre-buy.
Chris was wondering, if the pre-buy items look good, is it a good idea to finish the pre-buy as an annual and split the fee between the buyer and seller?
That's two questions. The answer to the first question is, it is not at all uncommon for us to, once the buyer purchases the airplane, to convert the pre-buy into an annual. The airplane's all opened up. If the annual is due fairly shortly after the pre-buy is done, it often makes sense to have the shop that did the pre-buy just finish it up as an annual and do the paperwork and so on. So we do that sometimes. We don't do that other times. It's really dependent, but it's something that's not uncommon and is often a good idea if the annual is due fairly shortly. The answer to the other question is, it's a terrible idea to split the fees. You never ever want to do that. The pre-buy has to be paid solely by the buyer, so that the person doing it, their allegiance and their duty of care is solely to the buyer. The minute you let the seller pay for any of this, the seller starts exerting control over the process. We want to keep the seller as far away from the pre-buy as possible. We don't want any body English to go on. We don't want the brokers meddling in the pre-buy. The pre-buy has to be independent. Now, we often will find airworthiness discrepancies during a pre-buy. And our philosophy is that the seller should pay to correct airworthiness discrepancies. But we don't want the seller to actually pay for those. We want the seller to reduce his price by the appropriate amount, because we want the repairs to be done under the sole control of the new owner of the airplane. We want to get the seller out of the picture as quickly as possible. The mechanic's duty of care is to whoever it is who hired him. If the buyer and seller split the fee, then it's very unclear who his duty of care is to. It creates an extremely ambiguous situation. So splitting fees, that sort of thing, is always a very bad idea. And again, I mean, it sometimes sounds good on paper, and a lot of people will go for it. But trust me, after managing thousands of these things and seeing everything that can possibly go wrong, it's really a really bad idea. That the pre-buy needs to be for the sole benefit of the buyer, paid for solely by the buyer, at a shop chosen solely by the buyer, and one that has been vetted to make sure that there is no conflict of interest, and there is no the shop doing the pre-buy has no obligations to the seller in any way, and has no preconceptions about the condition of the airplane. We want him to look at this airplane from a totally skeptical standpoint. I've never seen this thing before.
Gary's wondering, what's the general practice of sharing the pre-buy findings with the seller?
Um, the shop should never share the pre-buy findings with the seller. The buyer should share whatever findings he wants to share with the seller. Typically, the buyer will share findings of unairworthy items in order to negotiate a price reduction. But the shop who's doing the pre-buy should never talk to the seller. That has to be totally arm's length, and the findings should go to the buyer, and the buyer should do whatever he wishes with those findings. And typically, some of the findings will often be used in negotiations, final negotiations with the seller. But that should be completely at the buyer's discretion.
Richard wondering, is there a rule of thumb of how much a pre-buy should cost, i.e. for a simple or i.e. for a complex single?
Well, it's hard to have a rule of thumb. First of all, one huge difference between, say, an annual inspection and a pre-buy is an annual inspection has a well-defined scope and detail that's written into regulation. A pre-buy has no well-defined scope and detail. It's whatever the buyer wants it to be. If he wants it to be cheap and cursory, if he wants it to be extremely intensive. I mean, we do have some rules about pre-buys not being terribly invasive without getting the prior permission of the seller. I mean, it'd be really uncool for a buyer to to start pulling cylinders off and taking wings off and stuff of an airplane that they don't own. That's not cricket. So occasionally we will want to do something that's a little more invasive than what we normally do, say, during an annual inspection, like, for example, pulling lifters and to look at the cam. We would never do that without asking the seller's permission and say, here, this airplane is, we've researched the logbooks, the airplane has been very inactive for the last 18 months in an area of significant corrosion risk, and therefore we would like to pull 4 lifters and take a look at the cam lobes. Is that okay? We would never do that without the seller's permission, though. Pre-buy should never be, more invasive than say an annual inspection, without asking the seller's permission. I think I got a little off track from what the original question was. I'm sorry. You might want to remind me what question I was answering, because
Yeah,
or did I answer it?
I think you answered it. Yep.
Okay.
So on to the next here. Stanley was wondering, how is your fee determined, and do you contract with the inspection
Oh,
company, or does the buyer do that?
wait a minute. Let me back up because I don't think I answered the previous question. I think the previous question was, is there a rule of thumb about what these things should cost?
Oh yeah,
And
right.
I was talking about the fact that there's really no well-defined scope. Um, for an airplane, say like a Bonanza, um, the, we would normally say that the pre-buy needs to be at least, oh, let's say 10 or 12 hours of labor. Um, but if during that 10 or 12 hours of labor we find something of concern and want to dig a little deeper, then that number can go up. And of course, what 10 or 12 hours of labor costs varies widely from what part of the country you're in. If it's in New York City or San Francisco, it's probably $150 an hour. If it's in Texas, it's probably a lot less than that. So it varies geographically in terms of dollars. But and some owners, want the pre-buy to be to have a broader scope. Some want the scope to be, basically the scope of a full annual inspection, which is okay as long as you don't call it an annual inspection. You don't log it as an annual inspection. It'd be perfectly fine to do a pre-buy using an annual inspection checklist, although we normally don't recommend doing that because there's just a lot of stuff you have to do on an annual inspection that really doesn't make sense to be done on a pre-buy because it wouldn't affect the buyer's purchase decision and it wouldn't really affect the price negotiations. I mean, for example, you got to check control cable tensions on an annual. You got to check brake disc thickness on an annual. All sorts of stuff like that. That wouldn't have any influence on the purchase transaction. So we wouldn't do that sort of thing during a pre-buy. On the other hand, the things that could cost a lot of money, we want to go pretty deeply into on a pre-buy. So, for example, we don't usually worry about the condition of the cam on an annual inspection. We don't go looking for trouble and sticking borescopes in the engine looking at the cam, because cam problems aren't a safety of flight item. They're only a safety of wallet item. So normally if the engine is making metal, we're fine with it. But during a pre-buy, it makes all the difference in the world. If the engine's going to have to get torn down, the difference between whether the seller has to tear it down or whether the buyer has to tear it down is very significant. So that's why the approach to a pre-buy should be totally different than the approach to an annual inspection. There's lots of stuff we look for on a pre-buy that you wouldn't look for on an annual, and there's a lot of stuff you look at for in an annual that doesn't really make any sense to do during a pre-buy because it wouldn't affect the decision or the price negotiations.
Jim wonders, does a typical pre-buy include an estimate of the cost to repair the discrepancies found?
Yes, I mean we normally will ask the shop to provide repair estimates. We don't necessarily have that shop do the repairs. And one of the funny things is we often have to remind buyers that they're not allowed to do repairs on the airplane because they don't own it yet. Frequently the airplane will be in for pre-buy and the owner will say, hey, what could you add an engine monitor and and an ADS-B and stuff like that. We say, hey, wait a minute, you don't own that airplane yet. You can't do that stuff. You can only do that stuff once title once you decide to buy the airplane and title transfers to you, then it's your airplane. You can do whatever you want with it. But as long as it's not your airplane, all you're doing is looking at it. You're not allowed to modify it. A hard concept for a lot of buyers, because again, these buyers have already bought the airplane in their mind. You know, they think it's theirs even though it's not theirs yet.
Mm-hmm. Keith wonders, does Savvy furnish a pre-buy checklist for that make and model, or is the mechanic to use his own checklist?
We normally provide the checklist. There is no, there is no standard pre-buy checklist, because a pre-buy is not a well-defined thing. It's not in the regs anyplace. A pre-buy can have as broad or narrow a scope and detail as the buyer wants. And we normally, when somebody hires us to manage a pre-buy, we normally provide the pre-buy checklist.
Steven says, I've seen several aircraft for sale that state fresh annual. I always felt that a fresh annual was a red flag. Do you agree?
No, a fresh annual just means that the annual came due right before you found the airplane. But what would be a red flag would be a suggestion that because it has a fresh annual doesn't need a pre-buy, because that is just absolutely not true. And we've seen many cases of buyers that relied on the annual inspection to make their purchase decision, and that is a very, very bad thing to do.
Harrison wonders, if a buyer can't find someone who is familiar with the aircraft type, make, and model within a reasonable distance, what do you recommend?
Well, occasionally we will need to fly somebody in.
Mark,
And it depends on the, make and model. If you're buying a Cessna 182, it's usually very easy to find somebody who's got good familiarity with the airplane. If you're buying a, part Navia or something, then it may be a lot more difficult.
quite a few people.
I used to own a Blanca Super Viking, and there were only, I could count the number of people who knew something about that airplane on the fingers of one hand. And I actually I live in California. I would fly my airplane to Texas to get the annuals done, because it's, so it's a fairly rare airplane.
Mm-hmm. Richard's question is typical. There's quite a few people that have asked this, but what is included in Savvy's services for pre-buy, and what's the approximate cost?
Well, we actually, as of the first of this year, we changed the way we deal with pre-buys. We used to manage pre-buys sort of as an a la carte service, and we stopped doing that. So now, if you want Savvy to manage a pre-buy, you have to enroll it in our managed maintenance service, which is called Savvy MX. And so the fee for that, the annual fee for that is $899, and that winds up covering Savvy's managing the pre-buy, the first annual inspection on your watch, and all of the scheduled and unscheduled maintenance for the 12 months after you buy the airplane. We don't manage pre-buys on an a la carte basis anymore. It used to be that we did, and then the vast majority of our pre-buy clients would enroll their airplanes in Savvy MX after they bought them. And so we just made the decision to just roll pre-buy or pre-buy management in as part of the Savvy MX service rather than have it as a separate service.
Walter wonders, is there any differences when buying a home-built or experimental plane?
Well, for one thing, it's often harder to find people who are willing to do a pre-buy on an experimental. Some shops just don't want to work on experimentals. But other than that, the principles are really the same. and want somebody that has expertise in the airplane, and you want to make sure that they're completely independent. And
Mark was wondering, the logbook entry from a pre-buy, should the AMP be signing that off?
well, that's a really, really good question. I'm glad you asked that. The only thing that should appear in the logbook after a pre-buy is that the mechanic did an oil change and cut open the oil filter. Okay, a pre-buy is not a maintenance event and should never be a maintenance event, and the pre-buy findings should never be entered in the logbook. That's one of the reasons that one of many reasons that an annual inspection is not an appropriate substitute for a pre-buy. I mean, think about it. If you're the seller of an airplane and somebody comes to you as a prospective buyer and says, I want to do a pre-buy in your airplane because I'd like to buy the airplane, and you agree to let them do a pre-buy and to take the airplane, 50 miles away to some shop that they choose or some mechanic that they choose to do the pre-buy, it would be fundamentally unfair if that mechanic 50 miles away that you didn't get to choose could ground your airplane and could say, hey, this airplane's unairworthy. You can't fly it unless you do a whole bunch of repairs that I'm going to hold you hostage for. It's just fundamentally wrong to allow that to happen. And I've seen it play out that way a lot of times, but it's a really bad situation. So a pre-buy is not an inspection. You will never hear me use the phrase pre-buy inspection. I always use the phrase pre-buy examination, pre-buy exam, never inspection, because the word inspection has a regulatory meaning. An inspection is an airworthiness determination event, and it gets logged that way. And pre-buy should never be the way pre-buys are handled. A pre-buy is a look-see. It is not an inspection. And the owner of the airplane is not even entitled to know what the findings are. He didn't pay for the pre-buy, and he has no right to have any information from that pre-buy other than what the buyer wants to use for negotiation purposes. It's just the results of a pre-buy are a memorandum from the shop to the buyer saying, here's what I found about this airplane. It should never wind up in the aircraft's maintenance records.
A lot of people asked this question. I'll ask the one that Steve typed in here. Does the buyer have any recourse against the IA that signed off on the obviously unairworthy plane?
Well, I have to be a little careful what I say about this because there's litigation going on, as you can imagine. What I will tell you is we're talking about this guy, Ed, it's not his real name, who hit Ed's shop went bankrupt and it no longer exists. So whether the buyer would theoretically have any recourse against the shop that did this annual, practically he has no recourse because there's no there. There's just nothing there. So, and this was clearly a fly-by-night operation.
Joe wonders, can't the IA be held accountable for signing off the annual with the bad cylinders?
How many IAs do you know that are high net worth individuals? I mean that's the problem. You can't really sue a mechanic because he doesn't have any assets to speak of as a general rule. That's not to say that there may be some mechanics in the world that have assets, but most of them are not wealthy people.
Mm-hmm. Dennis wants to know, would you have to be an A&P mechanic to perform a pre-buy exam?
No, I mean, there are no regulations regarding pre-buys. And as I said, the only maintenance that is done during a pre-buy is really preventive maintenance, like cutting open an oil filter. That's something an owner can do. So yeah, no, I think in theory you wouldn't have to be an A&P mechanic to do a pre-buy. A pre-buy is a non-regulatory event. Practically speaking, you want a very experienced mechanic who knows the make and model like the back of his hand.
Geraldo says, silly question, but would the seller should be told about safety items found in the pre-buy?
Well, I mean, I think ethically yes, but I would still say not by the shop. I think it would be a real breach for the shop who is being hired by the buyer to be communicating with the seller. That we really don't want that to happen. But it certainly would be fine for the buyer to advise the seller, hey, we found some serious discrepancies with the airplane, including a chafed B+ lead on the alternator that is potentially a fire hazard. And even if I don't buy this airplane, I think you really ought to know about this.
Ron just wonders if you have a missing part of logbooks, years where they're missing, is there a discounted price typically for something like that?
I can generally say that that missing logbooks do reduce the fair market value of an airplane, but I can't say much more than that because I'm really not a qualified appraiser, and I'm not tuned into like how much it would reduce the value of the airplane. Missing logbooks are quite common. We've got all sorts of interesting missing logbook stories. We had one client whose ex-wife vindictively took his logbooks and threw them into the fireplace. So, but I mean, I just know from experience that aircraft that have missing logbooks do their fair market value is impacted, but I can't really quantify that.
So Brian wonders, how often do you think, or would you get an appraiser involved in the transaction?
We used to get appraisers involved a lot more often than we do nowadays. Nowadays, almost all aircraft are listed online, where somebody can go online and in an hour pretty much survey the field of that make and model airplane of that general range of years and get a pretty good idea of what these airplanes are worth based on comps without having to get an appraiser involved. If it's an expensive airplane, it probably is worth getting an appraiser involved. But we don't deal with appraisers nowadays nearly as much as we used to. It's really unfortunate, but AOPA used to have an online service from VREF that they made available for free to AOPA members online, and that was available for years, and it was useful in getting some sort of a ballpark number. And for some reason, AOPA and VREF parted company. I was very surprised to see that, but that service is no longer available. I mean, you can subscribe to VREF service directly with VREF, but it costs money to do it.
Anthony says, would you recommend a pre-buy exam on every purchase, even a simple plane like a Cessna 150?
You bet, absolutely, without question. But a pre-buy on a Cessna 150 it wouldn't take very long. It's not a lot of labor, probably 6 to 8 hours of labor. So it's not a huge investment.
Blaine says, how can opening and closing aircraft panels for performing a pre-buy exam not be required to be entered in the logbook? It seems that some access events should be entered.
I've never, in all the years I've been doing this, I have never seen a logbook entry that said opened inspection panels, ... closed inspection panels. That's not considered to be a maintenance event. Nobody ever logs that stuff, ever. That they may say, that they did something inside the wing, and that the only way they could have done that is to open an inspection panel, but nobody ever logs opening inspection panels. I had a problem yesterday. I'm in the middle of doing the annual inspection on my 310, so I can fly it to Oshkosh, and I had a problem with the manual gear extension. I was doing a gear swing, and I couldn't crank the gear down manually, and so I had to pull up the floorboards, pull the seats out and the carpets out, and pull up the floorboards to get to the mechanism down there. Found out what was wrong. There was a piece of a foreign object stuck in the bicycle chain that I removed. Now it works fine. But I don't make a logbook entry saying I removed the seats, the carpets, and the floorboards. Nobody logs that stuff. I'll say I corrected a problem with the manual landing gear extension mechanism, but yeah, opening and closing is never logged. I mean, I don't know that there's a specific rule about what what the regulation says. It's 43.9 is the regulation that talks about logbook entries, and it says the logbook entry has to have a description of the work performed. It does not say anything about how detailed or general that description has to be. And some people write logbook entries that are like War and Peace, and some write very cursory logbook entries. And there's no regulation that says how detailed a logbook entry ought to be. But just from sheer experience, nobody ever logs things like opening and closing inspection panels. And plus it's that's not even maintenance; it's preventive maintenance. Something an owner's allowed to do.
Greg was wondering, in the case of incomplete logs, how can you determine compliance with ADs?
Well, that's the hard thing. When you're missing logs, most of the stuff that's missing is not that big a deal. But there are some things that are big deals, and if you're missing records of AD compliance, then you may have to recomply with the AD, even though you know it was complied with, but you don't have any record that to prove it. There are there's some other things like if you lose track of total time on some component that is life limited or has some kind of compulsory replacement time, that can be a big problem. Most maintenance records, I mean the FAR is 91-417, which says how long you have to retain maintenance records. Basically says most maintenance records only have to be retained for a year. But there are some records that have to be maintained indefinitely, and one of those is records of AD compliance, and another is records of total time in service of various things. So if you lose those can be a problem.
Well, Mike, let's wrap it up here. Looks like we had about 800 people logged in. Nice series of questions here, I think. Looks like we got 12 days to Oshkosh here, so you got to finish up your 310 if you're going to fly it in. Are you going to be doing forums here during the week if people want to catch up with you and see you in person?
Yeah, I'm doing 2 to 3 forums every day of the show, and I've got just between you and me, Tim, not to be repeated, but I got a lot of PowerPoint that I need to get finished before I leave.
You got 12 days.
I have most of the presentations sort of generally roughed out, but I've got hours and hours of work to do to get ready for them. So I need to get ready for this webinar first, but now the next thing is to dive into getting all my forums ready for AirVenture. I'll be doing forums Monday through Saturday, 2 or 3 forums every day, all different ones, and also doing 2 live podcast sessions at the AOPA exhibit, the Ask the ANPs. We've done live podcast recordings the last 2 years, and they were standing room only. So we decided we're going to do 2 this year. I think they're on Tuesday and Saturday. So it's going to be a very, very busy week for me. Any rate, just to wrap up, if you're not on my email list for the monthly newsletter and other good stuff, easiest way to do that is to text the word SAVVY, SAVVY, to 33777, and the little bot will ask you for your name and email address and put you on our mailing list. Or you can go to the Savvy Aviation website and sign up, or you can check a box during the post-webinar survey that Tim will put up as soon as I shut up. My 4 books are available on Amazon, at Aircraft Spruce, in the EAA bookstore. There'll be lots of them on sale at AirVenture if you're going to be there, which I hope you are. We're finished recording the audiobook version of the 4th book, Ownership Part 2. And there's just a couple of things that have to be done before it shows up available for sale on Audible. So that should happen shortly after AirVenture, but most of the work is done on that. And the first 3 volumes are all available in audiobook form, and the Ownership Volume 2 should be available in a few weeks. That was a big job. The podcast that I do with Paul New and Colleen Sterling, Ask the ANPs, is gone to twice a month, and we'll be doing 2 live podcast recording sessions at AirVenture. Now, normally when we do the podcast recording sessions, we get the questions a day in advance, so we get to think about them. But at AirVenture, we have no idea what people are going to ask, so it's a little bit terrifying, but it's always a lot of fun. And finally, the next 3 webinars, these are all on Wednesday. We're hopefully not rescheduling any of them. August 7th is called Unaffordable, Unobtainable, talking about the difficulty of getting parts, and how sometimes some sleuthing is necessary in order to keep our old stuff running. September, a webinar called Can't Sign It Off is I don't want to give you the punchline, but it's an actual tale of woe of one of our clients who declared an emergency because he had a rough running engine and wound up uh-oh. Am I still running here?
You're on, Mike. I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Hopefully everything was on backup batteries, so that's good. The lights went out and everything, but and they're back on. It was a brief power outage.
You're still good. I can hear you.
Okay, that's good. I was hoping I wasn't going to lose the connection. But at any rate, this is a story of how a rough running engine and an emergency declaration turned into having an airplane that was basically being held hostage for a period of many months. I won't tell you any more about that until the webinar. And in October, I have a webinar on sort of philosophical webinar called "Why Annual Inspections." That basically poses the question, does it really make sense that we should have to tear our airplanes all apart, every 12 months? Or would it make more sense for us to do phased inspections? And what the FAA would have to change in the rules to allow us to do that, because they do allow that for big airplanes, but they don't allow that for little airplanes right now. So I'm going to be railing about that a little bit and talking about the regulations and how they differ between larger airplanes and smaller airplanes, and what changes would be needed to give us a little bit more flexibility in terms of how often we have to inspect various things. And so that's all I got, Tim. We'll hopefully see a bunch of you guys at AirVenture in a couple weeks, or less than a couple weeks.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Mike. 12 days. Yeah, July 22nd is opening day. That's a Monday, July 22nd. So hope
that's terrifying.
we're looking forward to it here. We had a little bit of wet weather like the last couple of weeks, but this next week or to 2 weeks looks pretty good from a weather standpoint right now. So that's
just
good
make
news
sure
for
it's
setup.
not too hot. Okay, can you
Yeah,
do that for me?
we'll work on that one. Yeah.
Okay, I appreciate that.
We've had several days already over 90, which is that's unusual, even in June,
And
so
it's not a dry heat.
no, very moist. All right, sir. Well, thank you very much. Great presentation, excellent information. Thank you so much for sharing. And to everybody who tuned in, thank you so much for joining us. And don't forget, we got a webinar tomorrow night with Professor Paul Schuck talking about CFIT, controlled flight into terrain. Have a great night, everybody.
Don't do it. Good night,
Yeah, don't
everybody.
do it. Yes, very good.